Awesome. Well, I think we should begin because okay. So welcome everybody to our March Public Philosophy Talk. These talks are hosted by Loyola University Chicago's MAP chapter. And so what is MAP? MAP stands for Minorities and Philosophy. It's an international organization that aims to address structural injustices in academic philosophy and remove barriers that impede participation for members from traditionally marginalized groups. So in this public philosophy talk series, LUC MAP members interview philosophers in different stages of their career: undergraduate and graduate study, teaching, research, or folks who are working outside of academia in applied philosophy fields. Just to introduce myself, my name is Lillianne John. My pronouns are she, her. I am a MAP graduate organizer here at Loyola. We're being supported behind the scenes today by my fellow MAP graduate organizer, Gina. She waves hi. And I'm interviewing Dr. Takunda Matose, who is an assistant professor here at the philosophy department at Loyola University. We will be talking about his life as a professor, his journey to getting here, and his teaching philosophy, among other things. We invite all of you to join in the conversation with any questions or comments for Dr. Matose using the YouTube live chat, which you all should have access to. Takunda, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I give a very brief introduction. My name is Takunda Matose. I am an assistant professor of philosophy, as Lillianne said. I work primarily in the areas of political philosophy, particularly sort of post-Rawlsian liberal democratic theory. And even more specifically, I'm an egalitarian, so I care about theories of equality, and I think about how those function specifically in the context of healthcare. So really what I am is a population level bioethicist, so thinking about how different kinds of moral obligations and sort of moral frameworks should be applied within the context of healthcare. So thinking about justice within that context. So I'm sure at some point we'll touch on the various parts of my research, but very broadly, that's what I am, at least as a philosopher.
Sure. Thank you for that introduction. Sorry for the mispronunciation of the last name. Should have checked that beforehand. But yeah, I'll jump right into it. Tell us a little bit about your situation, how you came to be in the field more broadly in philosophy, academic philosophy, where you're from as such.
Sure. Well, those are disparate questions. So maybe let me just start talking about kind of how I got into academic philosophy. Maybe that's a better place to start. So, I really started out as an undergrad as a biochemistry major. I thought I was going to be a neurosurgeon. I wanted that was my dream. And so I got to college at the University of Cincinnati, go Bearcats. And I was a biochemistry major. And turned out I was not very good at any of the stuff I needed to be good at in order to graduate with that degree. But then I took an ethics course and I fell in love with it. And I got very good feedback from one of my professors. And essentially that started me on the pathway to become a philosophy major. And I became a major. And as I was finishing up, I still had this desire to do something related to medicine. And so that same professor, Julian Wirth, who's at Vanderbilt now, was like, if you're interested in doing medicine and you've got this philosophical acumen, maybe you should do bioethics. So that kind of got me into what I work on now, which is, again, more population level bioethics, and philosophy of medicine more broadly. So I'll stop there in case there are any other questions, but that's how I got started.
Sure. And I think a lot of folks who are part of MAP aren't in the philosophy department specifically. We have so many folks who are minoring in philosophy, taking just one or two ethics courses. So I think it'd be nice to hear a little bit about that process as well. Like, where along the way, what was it like to shift completely from something that was very much in the STEM, like you were orienting your life a certain way, and you're in this other world now. You said you eventually majored in philosophy and ethics, and then moved into, I guess, a graduate school in the same. So it'll be cool to hear about that process of developing that research interest, communicating with professors, things like that.
Well, so let me say, for me, the process has been kind of looking for the right word here. Iterative comes to mind, but there may be better words. But it's not as though it was one sort of straightforward kind of approach. So, it took me a while to get out of biochem, in part because I had parental pressure to remain as a pre-med major. So one of the things I always tell my students is, look, you may encounter pressure from your parents to stay on a particular pathway, whatever that is. But at some point, it does take courage for you to decide what you want to do and what your skill set and what your abilities, acumens are best directed towards. Again, for me, I don't think that would have been very possible without specifically one professor who served as a guide, and he's encouraged me again since undergrad. He helped me go get my master's, which was specifically in bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania. He followed my career after that. So, this is part of your question, I take it. So after I did my master's in bioethics, I actually took a little detour and I ended up working at the National Institutes of Health. And I was there for roughly 7 years. And so there I was doing bioethics and health policy, but I was actually working with medical researchers, with clinicians. I served on institutional review boards. I was reading research protocols. So that was sort of back in that kind of scientific world that I had been really intrigued in. And at one point, I actually worked physically in a hospital for several years. So, I did that for a while because I still had that interest. And then after that, that's when I went back and got my PhD in philosophy. So, but, in all these stages, it's really about trying to follow that passion, trying to find where my acumen, my ability, my skill set was going to be best applied, and then trying to see what would come out of it.
Yeah, and you stayed in academia after that turn and back into your PhD. You're here now at Loyola teaching in the bioethics center. You're teaching philosophy to folks who are going to stay in academia. So, I see you as having a very unique understanding of both the real world, as we call it, like outside the ivory tower as such. I wanted to ask you if was there something particular about Loyola that led you to pursue this position here, and what was it like coming in with that experience of having worked elsewhere in government, on the ground as such, and then looking at the job market like the academic one? We have grad students who are finishing up their PhDs, looking to enter a similar market. You joined us last year, am I right? I joined last year, so just confirming.
Very good. And let me say, it was not by any means a straightforward kind of pathway. Um, so I think it's worth kind of, in the interest of full disclosure, um, the reason I went to get my PhD in philosophy was actually because I'd sort of reached a certain point at the NIH where I needed a terminal degree to keep advancing. So I had my master's in bioethics, and it served me very well. But and many of you, even if you don't end up in academia, you'll find that even outside of that context, there will be a point where you will be asked, you'll be expected, required to have higher levels of education. So, especially if you want to keep rising up the ladder. So, that was really my motivation for going to get a PhD. And I could have gotten a law degree, a JD, that was an option, but I just was not actually very interested in that. I took it as an opportunity to get back to my philosophical roots and to have more freedom of thought and freedom of exploration, really, which I did find while I was doing my PhD. Now, as I was finishing up, it's worth kind of contextualizing the kind of decision I had, which is it was the tail end of the Trump presidency. The status of funding and jobs at the NIH and in government more broadly was much more uncertain than when I started my PhD. And so that forced me to actually take a moment to be like, okay, let me be much more, ecumenical and exploratory in terms of what I'm looking at in terms of possibilities. And I did have options in part because, I have this background at the NIH. I do bioethics also, which means I could have, and I was getting interviews in like bioethics departments, which tend to be more in medical schools. And so there's more of an expectation of doing more clinical work. And then I had options like being in philosophy departments. And one of the things that was most intriguing to me about Loyola is they wanted someone who did not only bioethics, public health ethics, but they wanted someone who had a background in philosophy of race. And so this speaks in part to one of the questions that I saw pop up. One of the things I do with my research is I think about specifically Black and Brown folks. So health disparities, maternal health disparities. And this was one of the few places that not only wanted someone who did bioethics as a philosopher, right, which is a very specific thing, but was also looking for someone who could do the phil of race stuff, and was thinking about that intersection between, issues of social categorization and as they apply to bioethics. So this was kind of in many ways a position that almost was kind of tailor-made for me. And then unlike some of my other opportunities, just the possibility and freedom to continue to do my research without as many constraints. So that's one of the lovely things about being an assistant professor in philosophy. You don't really have a boss. You kind of pursue the research where it takes you. So that's kind of why I ended up here. And there were other places, but this was a place that kind of allowed me to do all of those things.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that with us and for addressing Tori's question that's coming from the live chat. And I think I'll read her question out and maybe you can talk about it a little bit more, because Tori asks, can you speak on your experience as a Black scholar in bioethics and philosophy?
Yeah, it's, kind of a very interesting thing. So some of you may be familiar with Charles Mills. Um, Charles Mills is sort of this heavyweight figure in philosophy of race and political philosophy more broadly. And I remember, so one of the kind of things that's interesting about my sort of background, my story, is I think before I started my PhD program, I had exactly one philosopher of color as an instructor. So, that's through undergrad for my master's program. Just not a lot of, uh, Black philosophers. I got to Vanderbilt, and at the time they had Lucius Outlaw. So Lou Outlaw, for those of you who are interested in philosophy of race, is a very important figure, very avuncular. And he was at Vanderbilt. And then shortly after, Paul Taylor arrived. And both of them ended up serving on my committee, which was a very beneficial thing. It really did help shape and refine my thought and my positionality as a philosopher. But as I was sort of starting to write my dissertation, I met Charles Mills. And Charles had this long conversation with me about being Black and the academy. And, as you're all aware, because you're part of this group, Black folks are very underrepresented in academic philosophy specifically. And Charles said, look, there are certain kinds of philosophical questions that are being answered and being explored, but it would help to have certain kinds of people engaged in that intellectual pursuit. And I'll never forget, he said to me, Takunda, and this was before I decided to actually stay in academic philosophy, but he said, we need you to help Blackify the academy. And it is something that I really did take to heart, because again, there are not a lot of us. I think this is something that's starting to change. And Loyola, has actually, a lot of at least Black professors in a way that's actually fairly rare. And so I do think, representation matters, but it matters not just in terms of like, what you see and who you see in the classroom, but I do think intellectually, there's certain kinds of questions that are going to be explored when you have different people, and not just about people racialized as Black, but we're talking about gender, we're talking about various social categories, right? Disabilities, so go on and on. I think you need to have as many people, because that's part of when you realize different kinds of important and interesting philosophical insights and inputs. So I hope that wasn't too rambly.
No, not at all. And it feeds in perfectly well to so many other things that I want to ask you about for folks who are listening. But I mean, as also somebody who is an underrepresented part of an underrepresented group, it does make that difference, both in like seeing somebody else in the room who you can bond with in that sense, but also the kinds of intellectual questions that, as you say, arise. And I want to ask you about that a little bit, about that evolution in your, I don't know if we should call it evolution, but like how your research interests perhaps changed over time, or yeah, especially in graduate school, once you were like firmly in ethics and in at the PhD level, I guess, were your research interests defined? Did they change? You spoke to Charles Mills. He gave you mentorship of a kind that probably, yeah, love to hear how those interests were nurtured in some ways, some things were left behind, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say there's there's been a change per se. Although it depends on how you frame that. So one of the challenges, and this is something that I think is worth pointing out, whether you're an undergrad, a graduate student, and I think especially junior faculty, so people like me, it never helps to be too committed to your plans and your research agendas, right? These are things that are not fully in our control. And so just one quick anecdote about that. So when I arrived at Vanderbilt, I was planning on working with this professor, kind of had worked in bioethics and was very well-known figure, John Locke. And I got to Vanderbilt and I sort of took some classes with him. I even did my prospectus defense with him, so in preparation for my dissertation. And then it became clear that he was not going to be able to direct my dissertation. So I had to pivot. So I went from working with someone who was trained and who would have prepared me to write more of, I would say, like an American pragmatist kind of dissertation, to working with Robert Talese, who ended up chairing my committee. And that paper was more thinking about theories of justice and, in that Rawlsian tradition. But you have to be flexible, right? You have to adapt to the demands of whatever task is in front of you. And, for me, I did that pivot, but the questions and the concerns I had didn't really change. And so I think that's the sort of thing I would encourage people, right? Methodologies change, and we're all sort of, in some ways, we're beholden to our training and our methodologies to some extent. But one of the things I did appreciate about Vanderbilt, and what I appreciate about Loyola too, is in very interdisciplinary, in terms of philosophy, departments, you can learn that there are different approaches to some of these questions, but at the end of the day, it's about what are you pursuing, and personally, in terms of my philosophy and what I can, in the ways that I can control it, I do try to, build in a lot of sensitivity and a lot of responsiveness that's informed by the fact that I am Black. I also, and I didn't mention this specifically, but my name Takunda, I was born in Zimbabwe. I grew up in America, but I was born in Zimbabwe. And so I think a lot about the kinds of ethical philosophical questions, and that guided the classes I took, and it came into my dissertation, right? It comes into my research. And I think that's the only way of being kind of true to your craft, and continuing to contribute something that's going to be sort of really important for the discipline. So is that okay? Yeah. I hope I answered the question there.
Oh, we like rambling answers that give us so much. It's very rich to hear from professors telling us about how they've moved through their own journeys, especially while we're here listening and experiencing some of those twists and turns in our own paths ourselves. And so thank you so much for laying all of that out. A really quick question was in the chat, a little bit pertinent to that sort of feeling of taking risk, right? And this is from Brennan. He asks, how much did you feel like pursuing the PhD was a risk to that career that you had built up when you made the switch? You contextualized it with the Trump era changes and things like that. But was there that feeling of even with this, the understanding that you've got different trainings and you're standing in good stead, but still that apprehension, what was that like for you? Especially, you mentioned parental pressure as well. You're much older now, I guess, than when we were back in undergrad. But how was that navigated, I guess, because as somebody coming from a family that's not American, I foresee that pressure for a long, long time into the future.
Right. That's an excellent question. And again, full disclosure, um, it's super risky. I try to be very honest with people, and you can look at me, and I'm a success story. Right? I finished my PhD, got a prestigious postdoc, and I got a tenure track offer right out of the gate. Okay. None of that was guaranteed. And even now, right, things are still precarious. I'm an assistant professor, got the tenure track job, but I still have to earn tenure. Um, Things have worked out in remarkable ways, but we don't have to get into the details, but let's just say I make significantly less right now than I did before I started my PhD. Okay. And I'd started working part-time by the time I started my PhD, and I'm still making less than I did at that point. Okay. And getting a PhD, it takes a long time, right? I sort of got through it pretty efficiently, but it still took me 5 years to do my PhD. It's super risky. And I tell people, like, don't do the PhD. At least don't do it lightly. It's not the sort of thing that, you know, it should be taken up very, very flippantly, because there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that things can work out at the end. And even if they do work out at the end, there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. You in 5 years, again, just as an example with my PhD, one of my favorite professors when I got to Vanderbilt was Jose Medina, right? And those of you who might know him, he's now at Northwestern, and he left Vanderbilt after my first year, right? So you can go somewhere, you can think, I know what I'm going to do, I know who I'm going to work with, and then they're gone. You can go there and life happens, right? We're still humans, we still have different things. So I have peers who weren't able to finish. It's just a risky thing because, again, a lot can change in 5 years. But, so not to be too negative. So here's sort of the positive thing, which is just to say, but if you do have sort of really nagging questions, right? And you think, I can benefit from just spending time digging through this and just wrestling with these questions. And I think that's a good way of putting it, right? Philosophy is a struggle, and it's a fight. And if you're willing to do that, and you're okay with the possibility that at the end of it might not pay off, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. But like, it's important to know, again, there's no guarantee. There are very few jobs. I think the year I went on the market, there were 66 tenure track jobs in North America, 66. And if you think, let's say just so I'm more from the, well, I won't say that, but let's say if you were ranking schools, and the top 20 schools, and each incoming cohort is approximately five students. That's just 20 schools will have 100 approximately, right? Just 100 coming out each year. And there were 66 jobs, right? So even if you just had a very narrow pool, like, it's still very hard to get jobs. So that's something I think it would be Lucius Outlaw at Vanderbilt used to say this phrase, which I loved, right? It would be professional malpractice to not kind of warn students about that. But again, I do think philosophy for philosophy's sake is a worthwhile kind of endeavor.
Thank you. We appreciate the honesty very, very much. I mean, I do personally, entering the field right now with that kind of prospect. I do want to ask you the cliche question that every philosopher who sits in an interview gets asked, which is something to do with like, what's your relationship to philosophy? You've started to open up on that answer a little bit about this struggle, this tension. Is there something particularly that you appreciate or don't appreciate about the kind of work that we do, and if not philosophy, do you know where else you might see yourself happy fitting in, kind of a thing, somewhere that does something similar? You mentioned there's different methodologies to attack the same kinds of questions, so that's just me being curious as well.
Well, there are lots of different questions in your question. So I would say, let me first answer the question, what's my relationship with philosophy? I mean, I am a philosopher, right? So I wake up and I'm doing philosophy, right? I'll be at the grocery store, right, at the checkout counter, and then I'll have philosophical questions, right? Questions about the other minds that are surrounding me, perplexed about what's going on, thinking about technology, thinking, right, like this is sort of who I am. And it also, like I'll say specifically as a moral philosopher and bioethicist, I often think about my failures as a person, right? My inadequacy in terms of what I take to be the various moral imperatives that I should be committed to, and so that gnaws at me kind of constantly. It's part of why I do some of the things that I do outside of philosophy, right? So, I've volunteered on death row. In Tennessee, I used to go every Wednesday. Wednesday night, I'll go to Tennessee's death row, sit with 6 or 7 insiders, and just talk philosophy with them and do philosophy, right? Not just to do it as kind of an intellectual enterprise, but actually trying to live it. And I think I don't always live it as well or as often as I feel like I should, but I do think that's an important part of it for me. Like, it's not worth anything if at the end of the day I'm not personally, practicing the kinds of ethical life that I'm pushing and that I'm trying to encourage my students to get into. And so yeah, like I think that's important, right? Philosophy has to do work in the world, and I want my philosophy, whatever else happens, like there's on a quick side note, I hope it's quick. Like Jason Stanley, who's a philosopher, had this whole thing I think like a year ago now, where he was saying, of course, he wants people to remember his philosophy and to, he wants to be well known and read 200 years from now. I'm not that kind of a philosopher, right? In many ways, there's a lot of there are a lot of things about the kind of the life and the position I have that make me a little uncomfortable. I actually would love to be much more in the background. But what I do want is, I want to make a contribution to the lives of people. And if my philosophy can make people's lives better, then, that's what I want. But if I was doing something else, I mean, I've lived that life, right? I probably would go back to do like health policy. I would, you know, figure out ways to volunteer in ways or to get whatever work I can, but that's kind of doing intervention, meeting health needs somehow. That's kind of something I would be doing.
Yeah, it's a great way to segue into teaching philosophy, because you talk about your philosophy having impact and actually doing something in the world, and teaching seems to be one of those direct points of well, I'm not sure you can be in the backseat, but you tell us how that relationship, your relationship to philosophy, translates into teaching. What's your teaching philosophy like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one way that it sort of translates is so it relates to actually this service that I was talking about at Riverbend Maximum Security Institute. Um, so it was a philosophy class, but really it was more kind of like a philosophical community in a carceral setting. That's how I would describe it. And the name of our group was called Reach. And they're still sort of going on down in Nashville. But Reach stands for Reciprocal Education and Community Healing. And one of the things that we were very intentional about is that, so for example, we didn't have leaders per se. I was a facilitator for the group, so I was on the outside. So part of what I would do is help organize things, help organize the people who would come in. But we had this view of that group as being not hierarchical, although it's hard to completely get rid of hierarchies, right? Because you still need people who help things get done. But we did really take that reciprocity very seriously. And it's actually something that I've taken, because in that context, the idea was that we would have certain things that we would bring in. You know, I was getting my PhD at the time, so I would bring in all this theory and right, all this conceptual stuff, this, you know, kind of stuffy academic stuff. But then they would also bring in their experiences, their highly developed thoughts. And in fact, here I'll pitch one of the projects. I think it's on my website. You know, one of the papers I wrote while I was finishing up grad school was actually co-written by Abu Ali, who is an insider, who actually, fortunately for him, he recently had his death penalty was reduced to a life sentence. So, which is great. But that's just an example of the kind of approach of reciprocity, right? This idea that we all have something to teach, we all have something to learn. We lived it in that context, which is part of what leads to this paper. But it's something that I try to incorporate in my classrooms here as well, right? So trying to, I do a lot of heavy lecturing just because, I think it is important to share a lot of the theoretical things and to explain kind of complicated ideas. But, the sort of back half of my classes, I try to start doing much more kind of discussion-based, student-led kind of thoughts. So yeah, that's the main, if there's like one kind of capture, yeah, I believe in reciprocity, reciprocal education, where student teacher were going back and forth in the sharing of ideas.
Yeah, any advice, I guess, for those folks who are starting to teach or currently teaching, who value that kind of relationship with their students, with their own work, on how to incorporate that maybe in their own, like at the back end or while in the classroom? Folks are usually asking for like practical, like, how did you actually make it happen, kind of a thing. Just
Yeah.
advice.
Well, it's hard work. That's one thing. And I will look, so it depends where you are in your in your journey. I think it's something that I wasn't very comfortable with when I first started teaching. Um, and I also want to acknowledge, right? So there are gender dynamics that are at play. It's far easier for me to sort of cede some control in classrooms than, for example, people who are gendered as women and people, who may be gender minorities, right? Um, that's something that is important to kind of acknowledge. But one of the things that, again, and I'm still, this is my first year, so if any of my students are out there and they're saying, yeah, he's not very good at this, give me a little bit of time. But one of the things I try to do, so just quick example, so I do use a lot of the educational software. One of them I use is Perusal. Perusal allows you to do kind of communal readings together, and it's all online, or sometimes I have podcasts and videos. So all the students are interacting, working off of the same kind of text, same media. But the advantage of it is, it also will tell me, okay, here are the places where students are having questions. Here are the things that are sticking out to students. And so then when I'm preparing for lecture, I'll oftentimes, so even if I am just doing more of like a straight lecture, one of the things I do is to say, okay, look, I noticed while we were reading, a lot of people, so we just did nudges recently. And so there was a lot of discussion about like subconscious elements of choice. And so then I was like, okay, I was going to talk about this part of nudges, but there's this very interesting discussion going on. And that's one way that you can do it without completely ceding control, but you're being responsive to what are the questions that the students are having, what are the things that are standing out to them, and then how can I help them sort of understand that and create a forum for them to discuss it. So that's just kind of one example.
That's super helpful, I think. I look forward to using that kind of communal reading thing. I haven't had it in a grad class yet, but it sounds super like fun, I think. Pivoting a little bit to the other side of being a professor or especially tenure track, there's this component of research that you're also perhaps expected to keep up alongside. What's your relationship between research and teaching at this point? I know it's your first year, but do you have a preference for one? Tensions there? Is it a fine balance situation? Just thoughts right now. No conclusions required.
Yeah, so I'll just say real quick. I'll use this as another opportunity for me to plug. So I have an article which just came out in Philosophy Today, where I think about, thank you. So I'm thinking about anti-vaxxers, right? So it's a kind of a demonstration of the kind of work I do between bioethics and political philosophy. So I bring this not only to encourage everyone to read it, it's pretty good, just saying, but to also just show, like I have tried to keep up with my research, and as a junior faculty, it is very, very important. In fact, so here's kind of a dirty little secret, but I think it's important to acknowledge these things. Research sort of is weighed heavier than some of the other elements. So, a constant challenge for me this year, at least, and hopefully becomes easier, but still working on it, is trying to balance being sort of a new teacher. I've taught before, but I've never taught two classes at the same time. And then this semester I have 75 students, right? So it's the most students I've ever had to teach. So balancing that and still being able to do the research, it's a very difficult thing. But yeah, I would say teaching itself is actually rewarding and enjoyable. It's the grading that's very difficult. And so in terms of the process in the moment, there are different things that are enjoyable about each, right? Teaching, you sort of see how students are reacting and when they're learning. And I love the moment, and you can always see it. When I introduce certain things to my students, and you see kind of the aha moment or their like minds being blown, and I'm like, yes, right? Like there's something really rewarding about that. But it's a very different thing from like research, and there's also there's nothing that can match that experience of working through a problem, struggling with it. The kind of work I do, especially like I have a paper that I've been working on for 3 years, right? And it takes a long time. It's slow. But then that moment where you're like, breakthrough, like I've figured out this thing that's been like bothering me that I've been like trying to get right, but I think I finally got it. I finally like that moment it's really unmatched. So I really enjoy both, but they're very different kinds of experiences.
Sure. I'm going to ask you to expand on what you're currently working on. I know you just published an article. Congratulations verbally. But no, what that project looks like. And as you tell us that, I want to invite those of us who are viewing on YouTube Live to put questions in for your open Q&A. We already have one come in from Renee that I'll take up first, but keep them coming for the last like 10 minutes of this. And yeah, let us know what you're currently working on. Big project, small project.
So I've got 2 articles right now that I'm finishing up that I hopefully will send out by the end of the semester. One is this one that I've been working on for years, which is looking at maternal health disparities. So for just very quick, a lot of people know this, but Black people who are racialized as Black, specifically gendered as women, which I think is an important thing to acknowledge, they have worse pregnancy-related morbidity and mortality that are sometimes 3 times worse than people racialized as white. And so this is kind of a problem with health disparities. It's been well studied and well known, but the solutions are very complicated. But I have a paper that's looking at that kind of problem as an issue of justice, and the kind of, it's called the Serena problem. And just real quick, the problem I kind of see there is many of the solutions that are offered to try to alleviate this kind of problem, they miss something really important about what's going on with this kind of disparity, which is that most of the distributive interventions that go into it don't help someone like Serena Williams, who famously had some very serious pregnancy-related morbidity when she gave birth a few years ago. And there's a lot more going on, but that's one. And then the other one, real quick, I have a big paper working on the concept of fairness, particularly in the allocation of scarce healthcare resources. And there, I'm thinking less specifically about the question of race and disabilities, but that's informing sort of my theorizing about what role fairness should play in the allocation of these resources. Like, is it a good distributive principle? So these are kind of 2 big projects that I'm working on. Hopefully I'll get those sent out by the end of the semester.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. We'll open now to a couple of questions that are being sent in. I'll start, there's 2 of them right now. I'll start with one and then go to the more fun one, I guess. The more advice-y related one, or well, life experience related one, is about you've been through the entire education educational process. You've been postdoc, you've done PhD, you're now job marketing, tenure tracking, teaching. What part of all of this did you enjoy the most? And are you happy to be like completely done with one specific part of it at all? This is from Renee.
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's no easy answer. So just two quick things. One, I'm not sure I'm done per se. You always reach a point where you're like, okay, I'm done. But there's always, like there are going to be fellowships, there are going to be potentials for me. I might actually, I'm thinking about doing another master's in public health, but but don't tell anyone, that's between us. But yeah, look, all of it is hard, right? Doing, undergrad was difficult in a different kind of way. Grad school was very difficult, very challenging, because you're learning the skills and you're going through this. The funnest part was maybe my postdoc last year, because again, no offense, but no teaching. It's just something just lovely, because again, it's not the teaching, it's the grading that's kind of like, but yeah, it was lovely not having to teach. But it's also fun being an assistant professor, right? And you do have those interactions. But I'd say now it's the fun part of it. But as you go along, you get this tension between things are harder, but you get better at responding to those hard things and figuring them out. And so there's like both satisfaction and tension.
Yeah. Very helpful, like to hear that. It's not really the end. There's so many other things that you'll now get into, and your previous experience will now like pad some of the ways you experience those for the first time as well. Another question from Renee is about the fun side of life outside of these four walls, kind of a thing, which is he says that your website shows that you're also a musician / singer. How did that get started? Tell us more about that. Is there something we should definitely go and listen to, or not?
I mean, I encourage you to listen to it. How did it get started? So it's something that I do think is really, really, really fun. And it's, here's one thing: no matter what you're doing, whether it's philosophy, or if you end up being a doctor or doing whatever, I think it's important to find things that provide releases, right? I love doing philosophy. I love reading philosophy. I love talking philosophy. In fact, I got in trouble with one of my friends just right before this call, because he's like, Takunda, I talk to you and you respond to me like a philosopher, and like sometimes I just want to have like a normal conversation. Well, I'm sorry, like this is kind of who I am. Although not to dismiss the kind of concern, but I love philosophy, but I think it is important to do things outside of it. Music has been one of those things that's just a nice release. It uses a different part of my brain, but I'm self-taught, and I was part of a really cool music community in DC. And it was a way to have camaraderie, friendship. Did a couple of tours here and there, so it's just a fun thing I do, and hopefully I find a good musical community here, but I'm still working on that.
Sure. I think that there are a couple of musicians amongst our faculty and students, and I think asking
Jam
folks.
session, let's do it.
Yeah, Renee unfortunately says RIP to the previous question, so you never escape, but glad to know that there's relief at some various points in time. And I mean,
Yes.
not to end on a sobering note, but I mean, we will be closing in about 5 minutes, but I did want to ask also to the music question, to finding community and camaraderie, and how important it is to like balance that out. It's a strange thing to end on, perhaps, but who are you outside of this space that we know you as? What other hobbies, interests do you like want to share with us besides the music one, that contribute to that balancing, perhaps? And yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, again, the music one, invite everyone to go check it out. Cabin Sessions, it's on Spotify. Um, but I mean that's a main thing that I do. I also have two dogs that I love very dearly, Lozy and Loma. They're English pointers. We love going on hikes. I love spending time outdoors and just sort of not having a lot of distractions, right? Like, and yeah, I'm just experiencing nature. That's a lovely thing I do. I love to travel. I love film, right? Fellini, Jean-Luc Godard, like my life I feel is rich and it's got all these things, but I think all of those things, again, like film is philosophical, music is philosophical, aesthetics, right? This is one of the reasons why I do aesthetics. Nature, you can think about, all the important normative things that are going on in the natural world. Um, so so I guess there's a bit of a false dichotomy here in the question. But I do a lot of things outside of the office and outside of like the academy. But yeah, music, I love to ride my bike. That's another thing. So you all will probably at some point see me riding around. That's me. Feel free to wave, say hi.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. I like that you call out the false dichotomy right there. And I mean, just to close us off, I guess, is any advice that you have for those of us in grad school, underrepresented groups in philosophy, like what things that you wish somebody had told you, perhaps, or not, just words of wisdom, kind of a
Yeah, that's a big question. So here's what I would say, and this is true for anyone pursuing whatever kind of objective, right? Whether it's academic, it's outside. So it's important to have courage. It's important to have hope, and find the people who will help you get courage and hope. I would not be here again if it wasn't for Julian Worth. If I didn't have certain professors, other professors along the way that encouraged me and said, Takunda, you can do this. And it's true. Like at various points, I'll just say this too, real quick. I used to work in tire warehouses. I used to work in factories. While I was getting my undergrad, and there was a point where I thought, I would be happy doing this, and that's things have turned out slightly differently, but that's not something I could have envisioned without support. So find those people who will support you and give you strength. At the same time, last point, don't be afraid to change, right? Don't be afraid to switch directions. It's never worth it to pursue something and keep doing something if it's not going to be meaningful to your life and to the lives of others. So that's my last point.
Well, thank you so much, Takunda, for being here with us, for sharing so much of your life and work with us. We really appreciate it here at MAP. Thank you for all those of you who tuned in to attend. And feel free to run up to him in the corridors, in classrooms. He's got a grad seminar next semester, I think. Thank you, Gina, behind the scenes.
Take my class, please.
I'm signing up for it. So and thank you all for attending and your wonderful questions and engagement as well. If you want to know more about what MAP is doing, we've put our emails in the chat, in the live chat. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you want to join MAP, recommend your friends who are interested in philosophy, would benefit from these kinds of conversations with mentors in the field. And thank you so much, all of you, for your time. And we'll log off now.